Happy birthday, Riverside Church. We're just beginning this morning a whole day of celebration commemorating 85 years of mission and ministry in this place. What a gift we have been given. We are inheritors of such an incredible legacy of faith and witness. And what a challenge we have before us, living into the promise of what God is calling us to do and be in this place. Today is also week 2 in a 3-week stewardship emphasis where we're looking at the assigned text from the lectionary for the week and thinking about, in specific terms, our call to live into a strong, unified, collaborative community of faith, one Riverside, in which we celebrate a radically welcoming place of belonging, where we learn more deeply every day what it means to believe in the gospel message, and where we embrace the opportunity to become God's best dreams for our own lives and part of creating the world that God envisions for all of us. Today we're exploring the opportunity we have to invest in a community of faith that institutionally reflects the radical gospel message and works at a level of excellence to form disciples who have the courage to live lives of radical defiance to the ways of this world. Not the kind of religion we see so often, the kind of religion that's destructive, that hurts and excludes, but the kind of religion that the book of James describes as a religion that looks after orphans and widows in their distress and teaches us to keep ourselves from being polluted by the world. A daunting task, if you ask me. Yet, if a pastor, say, were called upon to preach a sermon during stewardship season on a notable church anniversary, a sermon that would call the people to radical investment, you would think that that preacher would be jumping up and down for joy upon discovering that the gospel lectionary text assigned for today is a classic stewardship text. It's one that has been used since it was written down, I expect, to call people of faith to selfless giving. It's that little passage Mary read in the Gospel of Mark, 2 short paragraphs that seem unrelated, but which we're assigned to read together in worship today. Now, we know, of course, that it's always a mistake to look at scripture passages out of context. So to understand this little story, we have to remember that right before the passage starts, we find Jesus delivering a sermon in the temple, calling out the religious machinery for imposing crippling rules masquerading as true religion, rules that excluded and oppressed people. Jesus' call to the most famous rule of all, the most important, loving God and loving neighbor, comes immediately before this passage. In the first paragraph of today's text, we encounter Jesus winding up his sermon, the sermon I mentioned, by calling out the scribes and Pharisees who walked around the temple in long robes for the purpose of being seen, who came to the temple and indeed practiced religion for status and popularity. Then, having finished that sermon that I'm sure Jesus knew would get him into trouble, it seems that he went out into the courtyard to take a break. I feel you, Jesus. Preaching is exhausting. And while he was sitting there with his disciples, the text says that he started watching a multitude coming into the temple courtyard and putting their offerings into the treasury. Apparently, back then, they didn't do the offertory like we do the offertory. No discreet passing of the plates while beautiful organ music plays. No finely tuned choreographed usher board managing the logistics. No, out in front of the temple, in front of God and everybody, there was a big metal container. The container was shaped like the horn on the top of a tuba, like a big metal funnel Think of those plastic funnels they have in shopping malls where you put your coins in. You put your money in and it takes a long time going around and around and around till it finally goes down. Well, it was the same principle for giving in the temple, except there was a loud sound component to this type of giving. You couldn't help but overhear what was going on. How convenient it was then for those who had a lot to give. No paper money in those days, only coins. So you can imagine that, say, if I had a lot to give, I would dramatically approach the treasury container weighed down with all the coins I'm carrying, and then I would throw those coins in with a whole bunch of force, clang, 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 and naturally everyone would turn with admiration to see the generous display of sacrifice. The temple treasury was a convenient place to make giving a social event, and believe me, everybody was listening. Well, this was the backdrop to Jesus' conversation with his disciples that day, which made it even more easy to overlook a widow, the lowest of the low, the rock bottom of the social strata, who slipped in through the crowd and dropped her 2 coins into the temple treasury. They were very thin, archaeologists tell us, made of copper, together worth not even 1 cent. And they certainly didn't set the treasury clanging. They probably just slid quietly down the side. There was no reason for that woman to make a big show of giving her 2 coins because nobody would be impressed anyway. Nobody, that is, except Jesus, who pulled his disciples to the side and said, "You see that widow?" You can imagine their response. "Widow? What widow?" I was looking at the scribes. I was trying to listen to see who was giving the biggest offering, like you do at temple. Jesus said to them, "Believe me when I tell you that this widow has given more than anyone else here this morning. In fact, more than all the contributors to this treasury put together." And there we have it, the perfect setup for the stewardship sermon. Except, if you really think about it, this passage doesn't work well at all for a stewardship sermon. On the one hand, you could read this story and argue that it doesn't really matter how much you give. You could probably just give 1 cent because Jesus complimented the widow who gave so little. Or you could argue that giving what you give just isn't enough unless you give everything you have. You could manipulate this passage. You could stretch it a bit here and there. You could use creative license to make it work for sure. But truthfully, there is no direct financial application for us here. And the disciples, they were as confused as we are. You can imagine them looking at each other, brows furrowed, wondering, did I miss something? How come I can never figure out what this man is talking about? Jesus was perpetually turning things on their heads, and this little passage was no exception. And we can see why today if we read just a little further. Right after Jesus notices the widow, he gets up to leave the temple. And one of his disciples comments as they're walking out on the impressive architecture of the building. Jesus turns to that disciple and says bluntly, "The temple will be destroyed." It turns out that when Jesus was talking about the widow and the Pharisees and the temple, he wasn't talking about money at all. He was talking about religion. Organized religion, the institutions and communities that we build to reflect God's work in the world. And Jesus is inviting us to pay close attention to what makes for good religion. Because even back then, there was a whole lot of bad religion out there, and Jesus frankly wanted none of it. No posturing or showing off. No valuing prestige or prominence. No providing a platform to exalt the already influential and wealthy, all the while crippling the poor and marginalized with rules that you enforce using guilt and shame. No more of that. Good religion cares for orphans and widows in their distress and helps us from being polluted by the world. Good religion forms disciples who, in the rigor and wonder of community, grow into people who love God with their whole lives and who love their neighbors as themselves. That kind of community is rare to find and difficult to nurture because the world keeps pulling us away over and over again, luring us with the temptation those prominent temple goers faced as they hurried to hear the clanging satisfaction of their coins in the public offering canister. The work of building community where all people are invited to believe in the life-changing message of the gospel, that radical love that Jesus was always talking about, that kind of community, it is worth our lavish investment. And perhaps that kind of community, this kind of community, is one of the best things in which we could invest our lives, our talents, our financial resources, because as we work together to form disciples in the way of Jesus, one by one by one, we are changing lives and we are changing the world. Now imagine that you have recently found yourself at the leadership helm of a radical religious experiment, a beautiful cathedral in the middle of Manhattan, built with every little detail to display the beauty of proportion and perspective, of symbolism and color, inviting everyone who encountered the space to bring before God their best offerings of the human spirit. On the very first Sunday of worship in that new space 85 years ago, the New York Telegram reported a crowd so great that when the last pew was filled, a huge queue still half encircled the building. Only 2,500 people obtained seats in the nave and galleries. Another 800 were given seats in the basement, where amplifiers projected the sermon. The audience included many prominent people in Manhattan society, also persons from every walk of life, every nationality, race, faith, denomination, and creed, many foreigners, neighbors from across the park at International House, plus workmen who had built the church, masons, plumbers, stone cutters, electricians, wood carvers, all filled the sanctuary. As the incredible crescendo of a brand new hymn, written especially for the occasion, soared through the arches of the nave, worshipers could look up and see 8 red lights just above the chandeliers. And when they did, they could see the light flooding in from the stained glass windows, filling the sanctuary with beauty and color that could hardly be matched in a city renowned for its beautiful churches. Were you the pastor that day, called upon to speak to the care and stewardship of such a community? What would you say? It seems that Harry Emerson Fosdick, founding pastor of this church, took a page from Jesus' playbook that day and decided that he would talk about good religion. Fosdick explained his dream to be part of creating a community, an institution in which people might encounter Christ in such a way that their lives and this world would be transformed by true discipleship, the work of the gospel, true religion. Churches, people who call themselves followers of Christ, can distort religion, as Jesus noted the scribes and Pharisees doing in the temple that day. Jesus would insist, and Fosdick pointed out, that we create and nurture communities that form disciples in the way of Jesus. What builds a community of true religion, like Jesus taught? What builds a church like that? Hear Dr. Fosdick's words. To see that this world is not the child of chance and the sport of atoms, that God is over all and in all and ahead of us, hope like a sun forever rising and never going down. That does it. To find within ourselves spiritual resources like wells with deep springs. That does it. To walk in divine companionship so that across the years a man grows inwardly like the Christ he lives with and achieves dependable and useful character. That does it. To find life's meaning not so much in the things that serve us as in the spiritual causes we serve, so that by identifying ourselves with something greater than ourselves, we live expanded lives and leave behind us a fairer world. That does it. What if we could build a church here which would say, so that men would have to listen, nothing matters in Christianity, however long the traditions or accumulated the sanctities, not creedal codes or denominational partisanships or ritual regularities, nothing except those things that create abundant life. Without them, no life can be beautiful and no civilization secure. As we spend this beautiful day celebrating a legacy of forming disciples in this place, of helping people encounter Christ and come to believe in such a way that their lives are transformed, may we hear again the words of Jesus calling us to invest with all that we have and all that we are in creating a place where true religion is lived out every day. Be disciples, Riverside Church. Make disciples. Your community is doing that, true religion and worth the investment of your time, your money, your talent, your whole life. Friends, what if we could build a church right here that would show the world that the trappings of religion are worth nothing unless we are a community at work forming disciples in the way of Jesus? I believe that with God's help, we can do it. Happy birthday, Riverside Church. Amen.